or good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our September Listen and Learn. My name is Charlene Edwards, Director of Programs and Events for Project Unity, and it's our pleasure to share once again an opportunity for you to listen to someone else's story and walk in their shoes as part of our Listen and Learn speaker series. I want to introduce a very special speaker tonight, Lisa Ong. Lisa tonight will share the story of her grandparents who immigrated from China to Brooklyn, New York, where her parents were raised. How they worked to launch a Chinese laundry business and restaurants, and how they taught the value of hard work, education, family, giving back to the community. As you listen to Lisa's story, you will find common ground in the lessons taught and learned. It is through her story we hope you find that we really are more alike than not. If we recognize our similarities, together we can be better allies. Lisa is president and founder of Wishing Out Loud, LLC, where she serves as executive coach, speaker, diversity, equity, and inclusion strategist, and consultant. Lisa, before founding Wishing Out Loud, she was National Diversity Director of Inclusion at PricewaterhouseCoopers. She designed strategies to retain, develop, and advance diverse talent. She focused on employee resource groups, multicultural employee talent retention, and advancement efforts in growing inclusive leaders at all levels. Lisa is involved immensely in a variety of organizations, sharing her talents of coaching and bringing people together. And so at this time, I want to turn it over to Lisa so that she can begin the journey and so that we all can tag along. Lisa, welcome, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Charlene. And we did not plan to both wear red today, but I purposely chose red. Many of you think that's because the Chinese good luck color is red, but I also chose it to honor Botham Jean, who was a former PwC colleague in our Dallas office, and his birthday is September 29th this weekend, and red was his favorite color. And I promised his mother, Allison John, that his memory he was taken to it from us too soon in this history of Dallas at age 26, and he had a reputation as someone who was kind, compassionate, and a servant leader. And I believe as long as people say your name, you're never fully gone. So I promised his mother in every presentation that we would continue to hashtag be like Bo and keep that servant leadership story going. And I told Charlene I would try not to cry, but as a mother losing a child, I just can't imagine what she went through. But to start off on a positive note, I'm so honored that you asked me to join you today. In fact, the first time you asked me to join you, I said, "Are you sure I should be your speaker? I'm not originally from Dallas, but I got here as fast as I could, right? I didn't move here until 1997. My company, at the time I was working for PricewaterhouseCoopers, they moved me here. And she said, I really want to invite you and encourage you to reflect on your story, be courageous, and be a little more vulnerable to share more about your origin story. And I thought, that's interesting because I usually say I'm third generation Chinese American, right? My grandparents came here, my parents were born here, and I was born here. But I never asked the question, why did Grandma and Grandpa come to the United States? How did they get here, right? What was their life like back then? And so to honor their memory and their story, I said I better fact check because I'm always accurate. So I wanted to say, yes, I'm the proud granddaughter of Du and Chin, Du and Jin Hom, which is my father's parents, and George and Joan Chin, who were my mother's parents. So I'm the proud daughter of Liz and George Hom. And it's my honor to share their story and their journey, which, as I went back and reflected on it, I uncovered so much more deeper understanding of Chinese American contributions to history. Because as I was exploring, I said, wait a minute, as a CPA, I did the math. I said, if Grandpa came over in the early 1900s and were Chinese, how did he get in? Because the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was the first significant legislation to block immigration for Chinese immigrants. So I said, how did he get here? Right? And that's when we found out. that he came over on a boat. He was one of two, they said back then, lucky children. Um, I guess they were age 10 or 11 to be chosen to leave their village, right, to come to America to learn a new skill. If they stayed where they were facing jobs in factories, the farm, or going into the army. So they got the honor of getting on a ship and coming to America, leaving their families, not knowing English. And I discovered the reason they both grandparents opened Chinese laundries was because back then in the early 1900s, 1 in 4 Chinese immigrants worked in the hand laundries. Now think about this. You're like, they didn't have washing machines back then, right? The workers who worked in the hand laundries worked 10 to 16 hours a day. If you look at the pictures, I wish I would have thought to make a slideshow. The pictures were like these big tubs with cranks, right, with hot water, and then you had to iron all the clothes by hand. And I remember as a child in my grandfather's Chinese laundry, my father's father, he owned that laundry until he passed away. My mother's father owned his laundry, but then he became a mega laundry and he kind of become an entrepreneur and did a bunch more. So I'll explain that later. But in the hand laundry, they had those big old iron, heavy metal irons, not like the irons we have today. You had to heat it up, and then it was very dangerous work. You had to pay attention to what you were doing. But vividly, I remember back then, they didn't have cash registers. He had an abacus. Right. So that was my first exposure to business, counting money and using an abacus. Many of you know I'm an accountant, the language of business, right? We use calculators now. But I remember standing there watching him deliver the laundry, the clean laundry to the customers when they came in, the old-fashioned way. They'd ring the bell on the counter, and their laundry would be pressed and wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. And I asked my parents, I said, how could they compete in hand laundries, right? How can you make money in that? You weren't paid very much. How can you compete coming to this country where you don't understand English? How are you going to sell your services? And she said, Lisa, back then people didn't have a lot of transportation, so you went to the closest laundry. So you had to just set up in a neighborhood where there were lots of families and there was lots of laundry that needed to be done. It's like interesting. Well, my father's family, they had 6 children. So back then, the way you staffed your businesses was with family. So my grandparents on that side had 6 children. My mom's side of the family, they had 9. So growing up, I had over 40 cousins, which was such a blessing. So whenever I say my family in the Chinese culture, it's not my immediate family, just my husband, myself, my daughter, and now her husband. When we say my family, it's the entire family. Um, and so I mention that because sometimes people didn't understand when I was working and I'd say I had a family event. They're like, how big is your family? It's like, no, we get together on a regular basis and celebrate everyone's family things. But I thought, what are the traditions and what are the things that I learned from my grandfather? So I'll be celebrating my 5th year in business coming up in January. And someone said, most businesses go out of business in 2 years. Where do you think you got that entrepreneurial spirit? And I didn't even think to go back to my grandparents. So my grandfather on my mother's side, George Tin, he became a mega laundry, so that once you become a mega laundry and a commercial laundry, you're actually getting the washing from the smaller laundries, and doing more of the work like the tablecloths, the napkins, and the uniforms of the restaurant workers. So that's how he started to get exposed to the restaurant business. He saw a sale of a restaurant across the street from the laundry, and he invested and bought that, right? Then he realized if you're going to compete based on location, he realized that the Jewish community in New York City, where they were in Brooklyn, they had more money and they loved Chinese food. So he opened a second restaurant in the Jewish neighborhood. And then after he saved his money there, he realized people coming off the subway from downtown back to Brooklyn, as they got off the subway, they were hungry, but they had jobs, but they were too tired to cook. So he opened his third restaurant there. And I asked my mom, why did he open 3 restaurants? Didn't he have enough work to do in the laundry? And she said, Lisa, he had 3 sons and he was
Mhm.
thinking about his legacy. He wanted to leave each of the restaurants to one of his three sons. I said, well, what about his six daughters? Well, in the Chinese culture, they really value sons. So in my family, I'm the oldest of three daughters. And I asked Dad, how come you didn't keep going for a son? He said it was too expensive to keep trying for a son. He said, that's why I told you and your sisters, to major in accounting, the language of business, to make good money to take care of me when I'm old. Right. He said, I wasn't going to try for a fourth and have another daughter. Right. But knowing that that's the culture, right, that they really prize their sons, when we were talking, I mentioned that because they really want to carry on the family name, right? And so if you don't have a son, you're at risk that your family name goes away. And the things I started thinking about the core values that I learned from my parents that they got from my grandparents, and I asked them. I said, "What was it like growing up when you were a child in New York City? Did you go to integrated schools?" They said, "Well, no, actually our neighborhood was primarily Jewish. We were one of the only Asian families. We were hard to miss with nine kids. Everyone knew the Chin family. And my grandfather wanted everyone to be nice to his children at school. So because he had a restaurant, he could order bulk ice cream cups with the ones with the little wooden spoons. And so every time there was a school holiday or someone's birthday, he would send his kids to school with free ice cream for the class. Right? That way your teachers like you and your fellow students like you.
Mhm.
But in the Chinese culture, you call everyone by titles, not by first names. So I grew up calling everyone, auntie this, uncle this. And it wasn't till I was older that I started to realize that Auntie Peggy, who was blonde, blue eyed, and Swedish, was not truly one of our blood relatives, nor was Uncle Lenny, who was tall, 6 foot, really tall. I don't know how tall. He looked like a football player. Uncle Lenny was also black. And I was like, oh, Mom, how are they our aunts and uncles? It's like we called everyone aunts and uncles out of respect to give a title to your elders. She said it was because Lenny was her best friend growing up. I said, well, that was odd. Why was Uncle Lenny your best friend growing up? She said his father was the superintendent of the three apartments close to the laundry, so it was a great referral for our business. He was also big, so the other kids didn't pick on me. If Lenny was your friend, you were safe. I was like, oh, interesting. Right. And I said, and why do we call Aunt Peggy Aunt Peggy? She's Swedish. Well, she was married to one of their best friends who was Asian. It's like, oh, okay. Right. But it reminded me growing up how diverse our family was and how our friendship circles were as well when you think about cross race relations. When I'm doing diversity inclusion consulting work, I ask people to reflect on their circles. Like, who do you let into your house? That's true belonging, right? Are the people that are coming into your house mainly of the same race? Never really thought of that, right? And I said, well, my parents were always hosting Chinese Lunar New Year parties and inviting all their friends and their kids. I was fortunate that my mom stayed at home to take care of us growing up. So we were, I think they called it the Kool-Aid house back then. Like she always had snacks and everyone would come to our house and we would do arts and crafts. And I grew up not knowing that we were not that rich. I always felt like I was well taken care of. I didn't know we were living frugally. That was just the way we were raised. Like I thought everyone cut out coupons all the time. Like that was my job, cut out the coupons and then file them. And then every time we went to the grocery store, right, you had to use a coupon or you weren't buying it and you had to estimate the cost of everything that was going into that cart to make sure you didn't go over our budget. And I learned math that way. I didn't realize that, but ever since I was little, you had to estimate what was in your cart, and I still do that to this day. Right? It's a way to double check. And then, of course, we always were told you better get the receipt to make sure you weren't getting ripped off, or make sure that if you need to return it, you've got evidence to take it back. Although some people have told me, well, my mom told me always get the receipt so they can't accuse you of stealing. It's like, well, that didn't occur to me, but that's probably a good reason as well. And so started thinking about how my mom raised us and how she was able to do that frugally. And even growing up, when I got my first paid job, I used to babysit for my sisters. I didn't get paid for that. And then when I started babysitting, I think we only got like 50 cents an hour back then. But my first job where I actually got a W-2, I was flipping burgers at Wendy's. And I realized I wasn't good at it because I'm petite and my arms aren't long enough, and I would burn my arms trying to get to the burgers in the back. So by the time you get to the burgers in the back of the grill, if you're burning the burgers, they pretty much fire you from that job. So they moved me to cashier. And when you're a cashier, they're like, hey, she has a knack for money. Her drawer always balances. And I started thinking about it. It's muscle memory because my mom always taught me how to add up money in my head growing up. And so I started thinking about the other things, like what makes you the way you are. So when I was working at PricewaterhouseCoopers in audit, we were working long hours during busy season, and everyone else would start dropping like flies, looking at their watch, complaining, and saying, when can we go home? And I was like, we still have work to do. We're still here. Like, we're going to work till we get the work done. And they're like, man, you have a high threshold for pain. You're kind of, you know, too hardworking, kind of scary, Lisa. And I realized it's because, well, if your family grew up working 10 to 16-hour days, right, 12 hours a day is not anything different. Right. Even when we were little, I told my mom, I said, I still vividly remember sitting in the restaurant when I was little, and I think Grandpa told me to fold napkins just to keep busy. Right. Everyone had to work. Idle hands were not allowed. And even to this day, if I just want to watch television, I feel guilty just sitting there if my hands aren't doing anything, right? Because you were supposed to be cutting coupons or folding laundry or writing holiday cards. You couldn't just sit and watch TV. That was not allowed. And there's a lot of things that I didn't understand growing up because I wasn't allowed to watch television, even though I grew up in America. So people would say things at work like, beam me up, Scotty, with references to Star Trek. And even though I grew up here, I didn't get to watch those shows, so I'd be lost. And luckily, I did get to watch Brady Bunch, so when everyone said, oh, we're going to dial into Zoom Brady Bunch style, I at least knew what that was. But we use so many pop culture phrases sometimes, and we forget that not everyone grew up here, or those people who have grown up here may not have had exposure to it. When I work with people to think about diversity, equity, and inclusion, I really ask them to think about all the different things to say, how can we go the extra mile to make sure that everyone feels welcome and everyone can fully participate? And some of these non-obvious dimensions of diversity beyond race or gender, like socioeconomic class, can really make people feel othered or hesitant to engage. Like maybe I didn't want to show up to some of even the recruiting events when I was going through recruiting with PricewaterhouseCoopers. They would take us to really fancy restaurants. And growing up, like we didn't go to a lot of fancy restaurants. I think Fuddruckers was one of the nicer restaurants, right? Um, we didn't go out to eat much. And so when they took me to Brennan's restaurant and very fancy with lots of forks, multiple glasses, it was overwhelming. And I didn't grow up going to cotillion and learning all of the fancy stuff about, forks inside in and all of that, right? And I would just kind of sit and watch and be afraid. And they're like, "Well, are you going to have the turtle soup, Lisa?" And I'm like, "I don't think so." Right? They're like, "Well, they're known for the turtle soup." And I'm like, okay, like I was always told to be polite. If someone offers you food, you say yes. Right. So I was like, okay. I'm like, I don't think I'm gonna like this, but if they're offering it and it's supposed to be a delicacy, you say yes. Right. And then they brought us bananas Foster, and I'd never had that either before. And no one warned me that it catches on fire. And I saw the flame and it almost burned off my eyebrows and I almost screamed. Right. And I think to myself, if I'm an inclusion expert, how can I lower the anxiety for others who may not have had these exposures too, just knowing how scared I was at that dinner. Now I get to participate in etiquette dinners where we work with first generation college students, right? First generation immigrants that are new to this country and help expose them to what they might anticipate in these types of recruiting events so that they don't scream when the bananas Foster's lit on fire, right? And that they know which fork and which glass is theirs, right? I love the trick about the B and the D, right? You hold up your fingers like this, and the bread plate's here, the drink is there. That's how you know where your food is. Those are the things I didn't know growing up. The other hard values we learned was respect for your elders, right? As we mentioned, the title. But even at the dinner table, you always agreed with your parents. You always waited until you were asked a question, right? Children were supposed to be seen and not heard. And that's fine, right? But when you get into the workplace and they're paying you by the hour to deliver value and you sit there in a meeting and you don't say anything, right? People, number one, when they look at me, if I don't say anything, may think I don't understand English, right? They may not think I'm adding any value. I was not speaking up because I wasn't asked a direct question. And I was the most junior person in the room, so I always deferred to whoever was more senior or had a higher title. And then, unless somebody said, Lisa, what do you think? I never said a word. Well, I didn't know that's going to hurt your career because in the American culture, you need the loud, you need to speak up at work. But in the Asian culture, we're taught the loudest duck gets shot. Like you need to be humble, right? The nail that sticks up gets hammered. And so, how do you bridge these cultural differences? It's not right or wrong, it's just different. And how do I recognize that generations and dynasties, right, of these cultural values are in me, whether my parents directly told me or not? It was the way that I grew up and observed others. So, I had to figure out a way to navigate, right? This is who I am. This is what I believe. I don't want to sell out, but I have to figure out a way to show up and read the audience, read the room, and bridge the cultural difference if others are going to be able to see the value that I bring. And so now I feel like I'm a translator because I see these behaviors and I see other people struggling. I'm like, I've been in your shoes. I know how that feels, right? Everyone's talking about golf. You've never played golf before, right? I didn't know is a bogey good or bad. Just sounds scary, right? Um, some of those sports references you hear at work are very confusing to people who didn't grow up in America, even. I coach a lot of first generation Americans, right? And the sports analogies always confuse them at work, right? They're like, let's hit this one out of the ballpark. It's a baseball analogy, right? To a home run. But somebody's puzzled going, didn't you just lose the ball? Like, yeah, right. Very confusing. When we moved here to Texas, that was a shock because I was born in Brooklyn. We moved around a lot for my father's job. He worked for Shell Oil Company, and the way you got promoted back then was you had to move around. So I was used to being the new kid. I went to 6 different schools between kindergarten and 12th grade, which it's hard enough to be the new kid, but if you're the new kid and the only Asian kid, it's even harder. Right? They don't know quite who you are. And I used to dread that game, what kind of Asian are you? Because they'd start guessing. I was like, oh, are you Korean? Are you Vietnamese? Well, when we lived in Ohio, they would often guess Vietnamese because there were a lot of Vietnamese boat refugees back then, and that was the only exposure they had to Asians. But when you get that question, what kind of Asian are you? You have two choices. You can be defensive about it, right? Or you can lean into it as a learning moment to say, no, actually, I'm third generation Chinese American. And I can anticipate the next question. Wow, Lisa, your English is so great. Well, you don't speak with an accent. And I have to joke and I have to say, well, I was born in Brooklyn, New York, and my parents only spoke English when I was a child growing up. And the only time they ever switched to Chinese was when they were arguing because they didn't want us to know what they were arguing about. So unfortunately, I don't know Chinese, only know how to say Happy Chinese New Year's because that's how you get the red envelopes and the money. So, of course, as a child, you learn how to say that. And then your favorite foods at Chinese restaurants. But I always tell people that, I always anticipate they're going to say, you speak differently or you're funnier than I thought. And I'm like, thank you. But when I'm angry, sometimes you can hear the Brooklyn. In fact, one of my best friends, she would laugh and tease me and she's like, your Brooklyn's coming out. And I was like, I very rarely get angry, but when I do, she can tell. I know we're running out of time, but there's so many stories that come up, and I really believe in the power of stories. As I work in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space, from the very beginning, I said that I'm going to anchor on belonging because there's so much confusion about what's diversity, what's equity. Of course, I'm inclusive, Lisa, right? But if I say I anchor on belonging, most people know the hurt and how it feels not to belong, right? And belonging is what we're going for. And it makes me really sad that people are co-opting the word DEI and saying, oh, you're a DEI hire, you didn't earn it, right? That's not what the intent was, right? It was to create a level playing field. It's not creating extra to be fair, right? It's using a different lens to say, what's it going to need to make sure everyone has equal access, right? And someone said, well, that's playing favorites. I was like, well, if you have children, you don't treat all your children the same, right? If you have a left-handed child, you don't force them to use right-handed scissors. You meet them where they are. And so as an inclusion strategist, I'm hoping to widen people's lens through the power of stories to say it's not your fault that you're blissfully unaware. But if we shared more stories, right? Hopefully you would remember to bring left-handed scissors if you have any child's event because you have right-handed privilege. People get really upset when you say you have privilege. They're like, I wasn't rich. Like, but you have right-handed privilege. And simply what that means is the world conspires in your favor and you don't know it, right? You never have to take your watch off to adjust the time, right? The seatbelt's way easy to put on when you're right-handed. In school, the desk always flowed down on the right side that where you needed to write. And so I try to use stories and analogies to get people to bridge understanding. They're like, oh, you're right. There's a lot of different things in the world that conspire in my favor and I don't know it. Even as a third generation Chinese American, I know I have privilege. Right? People consider Asians the model minority. When I first started in the diversity space, there were programs only for underrepresented minorities. And I'm like, I'm in the Office of Diversity and we're not doing anything for Asians? Right? And it was like, well, there's plenty of you. It's like, well, it depends on where you sit. From where I'm sitting, there's not a lot of Asians at senior leadership. There's not a lot of East Asian women in senior leadership. Unfortunately, they use the term Asian American Pacific Islander, AAPI, to lump us all together. But there's different levels of acculturation, there's different countries of origin. And if people just looked at the disaggregated data, they would see we're not all crazy rich either, right? There's still a high percentage of first generation refugees that are still, needing help and support as well. And I think back to the days of when my grandfather came here with nothing and had to learn the hand laundry business to be able to make a living for himself and his kids. I think, how are we being accessible for the new generation of refugees coming to this country, right? And the fact that the law, the Chinese Exclusion Act, kept getting extended, the fact that you could exclude people just for who they were and keep extending it and not repealing that law until 1943 and only because China was an ally against Japan. Like, really? That's a long time to exclude people from this country just because of who they are. And then I think of all the contributions my grandfather made to this country. He sponsored so many other people to come to this country. He taught us that when you made money, you always had to save, but you always had to give because he felt to give back was important because of the missionaries that took care of him when he was a child. I never realized why we were Presbyterian. We were raised Christian and Presbyterian. I thought it was because my grandfather told me the Presbyterian church in New York Chinatown's the biggest church, right? He never went back and told us the history of how when he got here it was a Presbyterian missionary couple that took care of him, right? I don't think we ever pushed them to talk about the trauma that they experienced back then. My grandfather was always like moving forward, right? And hopefully, oh, that's and when I asked the questions of my relatives to try to get some fact check, this was one of the pictures I'd never seen before. It's my grandfather standing behind the two women. You can see the couple was the missionary couple taking care of not only him but several other young Chinese boys that were brought over to work in the hand laundries. And I actually was hesitant to even share this story because of the stigma of undocumented workers and did he come here illegally? And then I thought, you know what? I know that I'm here legally. My parents were born here. I was born here. But we're not caught up in our labels. It's the impact that we have once we got here. And he sponsored so many people to come here. He donated so much money to the church. And when he passed away in his 80s, I still remember this. He had a huge Chinese funeral procession in New York, Chinatown. They had policemen on motorcycles blocking the traffic. And these professions, the big funeral processions have music and bands and all the relatives. Of course, I had over 40 cousins, 20 aunts and uncles. We were all behind the motorcade. But then all of the families, generations of families that he had helped come over, he would give them all jobs, right? Even if they could peel onions, right, or peel potatoes, he would give them a job because he had had someone bring him over. And so I think, how are we giving a hand back to others who need that accessibility? Because we have so much, we often take that for granted. And the one thing that I really think is so important is the right to vote. Right? They don't have the right to vote in China. And so that is something that we always vote every chance we get because we know the sacrifices he made to come here. And it makes me sad when I see people don't vote. Like it takes too much time. Early voting, it never takes too much time. You just have to plan ahead. So I know we're at the top of the time that before we're supposed to go to questions, but you know, there's people who struggle their whole life to belong and to fit in. And my wish is that belonging is being accepted for who you are. Right? I love Brene Brown's quote, true belonging never asks us to change who we are. True belonging requires us to be who we are. And I'm grateful to Project Unity for creating this forum, right, where we can share and unapologetically be who we are. It's those types of deep conversations that you never really get to have. And it's through the power of the stories that it widens your awareness, right? It was the power of the stories when someone asked me, why do you have so many Black friends? I was like, because it goes back to Uncle Lenny, but also because all of my best mentors were also Black. There's something about being the only one in a room, you kind of gravitate to the others who understand what it's like to be the only one. And so I'm very grateful for them sharing their stories with me. And people ask me, well, what can I do to be a better ally? And people who know me know that I always say there's really one thing you need to do. It's listen, learn, and lead with transparency, leadership by example, and caring. Because if you listen, learn, lead in that order before you get into the TLC of transparency, leadership by example, and caring, that keeps you out of trouble like at least 90% of the time. And when I'm coaching CEOs, they're always like, Lisa, there's been a mass shooting. Everyone's upset. What do we do? I said, what do I always say? Listen, right? Don't try to come in and be the hero and do what you think. They need to be seen. They need to feel valued. They need to be taken care of. And it's tough sometimes, I think, when you're a diversity advocate because you're always standing up for others to try to be an upstander and a voice for them. But I remember during the pandemic, it became very hard for me because as soon as the early news started coming out about the pandemic and people were calling it the China flu, and I knew that, uh-oh, right, we're going to be othered. I'm walking down the street. It doesn't say Chinese American, it just says Chinese, right? And if I'm wearing a mask, they're going to think that I'm the one spreading coronavirus. And it makes you very self conscious and you feel very attacked and shamed and blamed for something that wasn't your fault. And I guess the comparable would be if you go travel around the country and you say you're from Dallas, right? And anyone that knows the history of Dallas will say, well, you're the city that killed JFK, right? It's like just because we live here, it doesn't mean that we're the ones that caused the thing. So I do ask people to remember that while we are upstanders and we are inclusion specialists for all the other groups, it takes all of us together to stand together. I was in a board meeting when the spa shootings in Atlanta happened, when the shooter killed 8 people, 6 of them were Asian women. And my phone started blowing up, and I'm in a board meeting trying to present on Zoom. And my phone is lighting up from friends very stressed out and anxious and concerned about attack. They're saying, Lisa, all this anti-coronavirus thing is now spilling out into hate and physical violence. And they're like, what should we do? And I'm in the middle of this board meeting presenting, and I'm really feeling the anxiety myself. I just started crying. And I'm like, oh my goodness, my dad taught me you never cry at work. And the tears, and this is something we taught my daughter. Whenever she started crying or got hurt, it's like, you're not bleeding, dust yourself off, you're fine, get up. Like, because the minute you say, are you okay, you cry worse. So I'm like, oh, and please don't ask me if I'm okay. Just let the tears roll. Finally, I said, I need a moment. And they're like, what's the matter? And I was like, I literally was just transparent. I said, my phone is blowing up. There's been a shooting. A lot of Asians are feeling stressed and attacked right now, and they're my clients and they kind of need me. And they said, thank you so much for being human and letting us know. We would have never really clued into that. And we probably have Asian employees here that are also feeling anxious and under attack. Right. So I was like, oh, good. I didn't get fired for crying in the middle of a board meeting. But it does just remind everyone that we're human and we're looking for those meaningful connections. And once people know who you are and how you lead and who you serve, even if we don't agree on everything, we can agree to love one another and move forward together. I mean, there are people at my church that believe very different political things than I do, but we both all believe in humanity, right? We all believe in doing good and helping one another. And so that's going to be tough in an election year. Civility and respect and kindness, right? Those of us who believe in it are going to have to amplify the good voices. I truly believe that love triumphs over evil, but I do feel that the press, maybe it's the algorithm, likes to pick up on the evil and the bullying more than the goodness. And so anyone who follows me on social media knows my social media policy is to be educational, right? Encouraging and elevating, right? Elevating the voices in the world that are doing good. I am biased towards CPAs and infusion nurses. I like to say I'm a cancer warrior, right? Even though people say in Dallas you shouldn't wear rubber, like Lisa, that's not a stylish thing in Dallas to be wearing a rubber bracelet, but it reminds me to talk about the great work of the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society to fight blood cancer. Right. I've lost three uncles to blood cancer and a cousin, and we're all human and we all bleed the same. And so the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society is finding a cure for blood cancers. So when they asked me to be on the Visionaries of the Year campaign, I was like, what do I have to do? I'm a couch potato. I can't run, walk, climb stairs, ride a bike. Like, what do I have to do to run, this campaign? They're like, you only need to raise $50,000. I'm not a crazy rich Asian. You're asking the wrong chick. And they're like, no, the Visionaries of the Year campaign is reimagining a world without cancer, right? And asking your connections and friends who also care about reimagining a world without cancer to join you. So, what I learned from that is we can do amazing things we thought we'd never do when we recruit our friends and our families and we tell them this is why it's important to me. And even every little bit counts. So we're doing this in 2023 and the recession is bad. I can't ask people for money, right? Not everyone has money, but I can ask them to donate blood. I can ask them to like and share my posts, right? Every little bit of activity helps. So I encourage people because they throw up their hands sometimes and they say, Lisa, there's always going to be hate, bullying, and discrimination out there. There's nothing we can do. And I thought, yes, there is. If each one of us tried to do a little bit more inclusion and look for the lost, lonely, and stuck, right? Smile and say the first hello. Take the time to pronounce people's names correctly, right? Those little things make a huge difference, right? And so somebody said to me the other day, they were like, oh, this is too complicated. I can't remember everything. I was like, okay, this is my favorite prop. This is what I tell everyone, right? What did I say? Listen, learn, and lead with transparency, leadership by example, and caring. If you can't remember that, just lead with love, right? If you put these kind of glasses on, imagine what the world would do if we all did that. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up and leave it there, Charlene. But really, belonging is something that I hope everyone feels because we all crave that connection. I'm loving all the hearts. I'm a visual learner. This is great. Thank you so much for coming tonight. You have so many other things to compete with today, and it just is so nice to see so many of my friends show up and have these kinds of cozy conversations. I would love to hear your origin stories too.
Absolutely. Thank you, Lisa, so much for sharing. We're not done yet. When you and I talk, and I think now you can, the question, the Q&A is open. So if everyone would please put a question in the Q&A box, I'll start to get those to Lisa. But while that is queuing up, the title of tonight was My Asian Mom Said That Too. And when you and I was a little hesitant, I didn't want people to think that this was going to be like racial or anything, but it. the point of that was your Asian mom said that. My black mom said that. I was sharing that with some other people who were of different races, and they were like, my mom said that too. And it's just interesting how, although we are from different backgrounds, different cultures, different regions, right? How our moms, how our families fed into us, some of the same ways. And as you were talking, I think I wrote down like five or six things that my parents or my mom or my dad, I remember them telling me those things, and I tell my kids those things as well. The one you said about get up, dust yourself off, right? My dad's thing was get up and do it again. If you fail, get up and do it again. Get back on the horse, right? And ride again until you get it right, right?
I would caveat that. Don't tell your child that because in preschool, at the parent teacher conference, they said your child has no empathy for other children. She tells them when they fall to dust themselves
Get
off.
up and do it again.
You're not bleeding. Dust yourself off. Get
Just
up.
dust yourself off. There's
It's like,
nothing
oh, I'm
wrong.
so sorry. She's repeating what we do for her.
It's okay. Don't worry about it.
I was like, oops.
When you and I were talking, the whole receipt conversation came up. And I was like, my parents told me to get the receipt, but my parents told me to get the receipt because, from the African American perspective, we didn't want to get accused of stealing, right? And so there's just so many similarities. You talked about large families, right? And having multiple cousins. I'm the youngest of nine. My mom is the oldest of 14. And you talk about cousins. Like we have so many cousins that it's crazy. It's even hard for us to get together. But just being able to relate with you, even though when you and we see each other, it's this, right, that makes us different. But inside and what makes us, we are so much alike than not. And as you work along those lines of inclusion and belonging, and Project Unity works along the lines of getting people to understand that we just need to listen to someone, to understand them, to see them beyond what we see here, and to see them as the whole person, right? And to engage in conversations, to be more thoughtful about how we see each other.
Right. And
We just
immersing ourselves in such, they're like, if I'm going to be a belonging expert, I need to know what it feels like not to belong, not just from my own lived experience, but
Mhm,
showing up in places where you are the only one, right? But
mhm,
getting to learn their stories and be an upstander and an ally means just consistently showing up. Like,
mhm.
I don't even say I'm an ally because I'm on the allyship journey, right? You're
Mm-hmm.
not an ally until someone tells you are. And there people are
Absolutely.
like, you go to all these events all the time. And it's like, because I learned through the power of the stories. And I know that if they don't have trust in me first, they're not going to open up and tell me the stories. But
Mm-hmm.
once you have the trust, that's when the vulnerability is there and they tell you things that you would never hear otherwise.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And as we wait for a couple of questions in the chat, I'm reading some of the things. If something that Lisa said struck you in terms of your parents, your mom, your uncle, or someone said that too, put that in the chat. Lisa, what also resonated with me was the idea of calling someone aunt or uncle. They were not family at all. You find out later in life they really they weren't your aunt or uncle or your cousin, but that's how you grew up. So my mom and my mom has been in the same home since the 1930s. She lives in Oak Cliff. And the neighborhood kids, everybody grew up together. I was the youngest, so I missed growing up with all the action. But there's a neighbor 2 doors over, and everyone called her sister. I grew up thinking that sister was sister and not knowing that sister was not my sister, but I didn't even know sister's name. Everyone just called her sister. And she grew up with, my brothers and my real sisters. And then to this day, I really can't tell you I know sisters real first name. But because we would go to their house, right? Their mom would take care of us, our mom would take care of them. It was family, right? And so, that's one thing that I wish we as a community, as a culture, tried to help maintain the sense of family,
Yeah,
right?
and that sense of neighborhood too, right? I just remember growing up where you could just run into anyone's house and everyone had snacks and everyone fed every other kid.
Mm-hmm.
And now I see the neighborhoods and I crave the old days of Mr. Rogers' neighborhood, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where it's like, where are the children? And even Halloween makes me excited because I finally get to see all the kids. No one lets their children out anymore. It's really sad.
Mm-hmm.
Except my one neighbor, they I'm the designated safe house on the street, so the kids know I work from home. And if they
Mm-hmm.
ever have a dog chasing them, or if they get off the bus, they can ring the doorbell because Miss Lisa will be home.
Miss Lisa's home. Absolutely. So we have some questions in the chat. And so I'll just start firing away with them. Um, Ron asked, I was wondering if you ever watched Joy Luck Club, and if so, what you thought about it.
Yes, that was the first movie that I watched where there was all like Asian cast and Asian women, and right, I was like, oh my goodness, right, and what it feels like to be a daughter. And mahjong, like grew up, my grandmother played mahjong all the time, so seeing that helped. And so I was really excited to start to see other movies where you have Asian cast because you finally felt seen. When I was little, I said, I'm going to be on TV someday like Connie Chung. Well, she was the only Asian woman on TV, right? Now I'm on Zoom, so I guess that counts. I'm on TV. But they one of the TV shows that really does touch more on Chinese history, although it is kind of a violent crime drama, is Warrior, right? Based on Bruce Lee's writings. There's 3 seasons out there, but it touches upon some of the Asian hate all the way back from the
Mhm.
1800s, right? And the battles between the races, because when the economy tanks, people like to shame and blame somebody, right? And that's why they excluded the Asians, right? Especially
Mhm.
on the West Coast, because they were working on the railroads, right? And their wages were lower than some of the other immigrant groups, and that's what led to banning the Chinese Exclusion Act, right?
Mhm.
So I was like,
Well,
oh, I didn't know that. But yeah, as we see more movies, I was watching that movie. I was like, wow, this has a lot of history I was never taught in school.
Yeah. What did you think about, to piggyback on that, about Crazy Rich Asians? Because when that movie came out, everybody was just, did that strike the Asian community in any particular way?
Well, first I cringed because as an inclusion leader, I don't like to use the word crazy. Right. So I cringed a little bit. Then I worried about stereotypes because
Mhm.
now they're going to think, there was another TV show I think called Bling Empire, right? Or something where it was all featuring all these wealthy, rich Asians. And they're like, they don't need any help. And I'm like, no, they're not showing the immigrants that are still coming over, still struggling, the language barriers. An example that came up was during the Ebola crisis here in Dallas. Right.
Mm.
The Center for Disease Controls is publishing all the warnings in English and Spanish. But in Vickery Meadows, there's high concentrations of Asians that speak very different dialects from around the world. And at the time, I was serving on the board of the Community Council of Greater Dallas, and I just asked the question, who's reaching out and knocking on the doors of the people at Vickery Meadows to tell them to stay inside and be safe? Right? They're like, well, we're not going to knock on their doors because a lot of them are not U.S. citizens and they may run or be in fear if someone shows up knocking at their door. But we were lucky to find translators for all of those languages through my connections at PwC, right? As a
Mhm.
global company, they had translators that we could tap into. So
Mhm.
it's using that inclusive lens to say, how are we looking out for everyone? I use that example because some people go, well, diversity, equity, inclusion is nice to have. It's not a life or death matter. I was like, when it was the Ebola crisis, that is a life or death matter. They're like, oh, I hadn't thought of that.
Yeah. Thank you. Another Gloria says, I too heard many of the sayings your parents told you. It further underscores how much we have in common despite cultural and historical differences. What more can we do to help others see our common humanity?
I think it's listening and also speaking up. So if someone says something that's an ouch, right, I could let it go, but I have to lean into it as a coachable moment because if I don't say something, they're going to go around saying that again and hurt someone else. So when I
Mhm.
first moved to Texas and they kept telling me, bless your heart, I thought they were being super nice. And luckily,
Mm.
one other woman that was not Asian and not from up north pulled me aside. She goes, Lisa, they're saying you're a dumbass. I'm like, oh, I'm like, oh, what did I say that was so dumb? Right. And so if you don't have someone looking out for you or giving you that feedback, you're just blissfully unaware. And I would
Mm.
love for people to go away from being blissfully unaware and be looking at things with that equity lens, right? And even accessible lens, right? Accessibility is another non-obvious dimension of diversity. My mother lost her hearing in one ear, so I'm always asking whenever I'm on a webinar, can you turn the closed captioning on, right? Or if I'm in a big meeting room and it's time for Q&A and people say, I don't need the microphone, I can speak loudly.
Mhm.
I'm like, no, please use the microphone because there's probably someone like my mom in the audience that needs you to use it, and no one's going to raise their hand and say, I can't
Mhm.
hear, right? It's going that extra effort to be inclusive just in case.
Mhm. Absolutely. That's, gosh, some great points. Michael says, love is an incredible denominator. Your angelic presentation on this complex topic is appreciated. However, did you get the courage to share your story? However, how did you get the
How did
courage?
I even get courage to find my own voice, right? At people who met me when I first started at PricewaterhouseCoopers 30 years ago, I was taught put your head down, work hard, right? And in a sea of cubes, if you put your head down and work hard, no one even sees you, right? It took getting passed over for promotion for me to figure out if you don't wish out loud, people can't grant the wish, right? And that's the name of my company, right? The logo is a circle because I'm an inclusion connector, right? Our colors are blues and greens because we're anchored on world impact. And the flower, because I like to say I'm a talent gardener, but that's a peony flower, which was my husband's mother's favorite flower. And the peony flower is for wealth and prosperity, and that's what I want for all of my clients. Right. But I learned that if you wish out loud, it's not bossy or demanding. You're giving someone else the opportunity to grant the wish. But you can't just wish out loud willy nilly. My registered coaching trademark is you have to invest in relationships first. Because if they care about you and then you wish out loud, they're more willing to remember the wish and try to make it happen. Right. I do see too many people who come to me and just start wishing out loud and are like, who are you? Where did we meet? Right. I do love to gather the wishes, but I like to know who you are, where you're going, and
Mhm.
how are you paying it forward and helping others too. Right. When you're wishing out loud on behalf of others, you're more likely to get that wish granted. Right. So Charlene, when you called and said, will you do this? I'm like, who, me? It's like, I probably wouldn't have done it for just me, but you were like, no, people really need to hear more Asian voices.
Right.
And there was an article in the Dallas Morning News just last week that said the Texas Metroplex is the leading the country in Asian population growth. A lot of people don't realize that Dallas Fort Worth saw the largest increase in Asian residents since 2022 to 2023, mostly in Collin County. Right. And when you think of the highest percentage of Asians in Texas, you've got your South Asians, right, from India, but then you also have Vietnamese is bigger than the Chinese population, and then Koreans and Filipinos come after that. So the question was, how can we get to know others? Look for opportunities to go to those cultural events that are different than
Mhm.
yours, right? Build relationships. So it's kind of weird. Don't walk up and say, I want to be your friend because you're Asian. Or like,
Mhm.
yeah, right. Just get to know us first, and and the stories will come from there.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to, we may go over just a few minutes, but these are so good and it's these this is great. So I want to get a few more questions in if you don't mind. Carol says, what's the best way to learn the different ways that culture has an impact, like not speaking up in a meeting? Obviously, learn someone else's story, but how do we make that happen?
Ask the question, right? In a kind way. So my boss one time, Chris Simmons, one of my best bosses, he noticed I was struggling to speak up in meetings. And he said, Lisa, I know you're a brilliant leader, but I need other people to know you're brilliant, so I need you to speak up in meetings. I can't do it for you. And I finally just said, because we had the relationship, I said, I'm not speaking up in meetings because y'all are all shouting over one another, and I'm just waiting my turn Right? And every time I raise my hand, this isn't like school where you're calling on me. It's very hard for me to interject into these conversations where you're all shouting over one another because I grew up where you waited your turn to speak.
Mhm.
He said, fine. In meetings, I'll say, Lisa, what do you think? We'll sit across from each other in every meeting, and I'll just say, Lisa, what do you think? And that'll tell everyone else to be quiet and give you the floor. He goes, but I can't promise to do that in every meeting. I'm just doing that until you get enough courage and confidence to read the room to know to interject. And then another coach that I had told me, Lisa, you are a people pleaser and you love to say yes. Guess what? If you say yes, people quiet down because they think you agree, and then you can interject. So now I say yes and whenever I want to talk, and they all get quiet. They're like, oh, she said yes. And I share that with my coaching clients too. I was like, if you're having trouble butting in, just say yes and
Mhm.
here's what I think about that. You can just to cut in line.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you. Karen says, oop, no, lost Karen's question. My middle class white family story is so similar to yours in that I entered a large public accounting firm and experienced the Brennan's recruiting dinner. Over time, I lost the idea that I could mentor, listen, learn, and help others with my stories. How do we connect young people with the mentorship opportunities with those who could use that?
Well, if you're an accounting firm and a CPA, I'm recruiting CPAs to go out to the schools. I have a long list of area schools who are looking for CPAs and accounting backgrounds to come to talk to the classes. And I can't cover them all myself. I try to go to one high school at least a quarter. And it's building those relationships, showing up in class and explaining why accounting is the language of business, why we're not nerds, and why we wish every student would at least know the basics of accounting because it's the path to entrepreneurship. So,
Absolutely.
right, just start with the young people in your area or wish out loud and say, I love mentoring young people. Every university has mentoring programs. I get asked all the time, will you mentor one or two students? I can't do them all, but I try to take at least one or two from every school.
Mhm. Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. So I am going to wrap us up on some kudos. Chandra says, I'm grateful for your tender touch and insight as an Asian American. Mamie, I hope I'm saying that right. I have so many aunts and uncles with no relations. My parents' friends were our aunts and uncles, and their kids were our cousins. Thanks for sharing your heart with us. Beverly says, Lisa, I'm so happy to hear more of your origin story. As usual, you're brilliant. Your approach makes the story come alive, and it does. The story just jumps and gives us a real window into what shaped your worldview. Thank you for your gift. And then lastly, Hope says, Lisa, I appreciate you sharing your origin story. Your use of practicality and your life experience paints a vivid picture of who you are. Thank you for the examples and always uplifting others. And I share these not just to, just read everything off the page, but this is a true example of how we are more alike than not, because through your story, allowing us to walk in your shoes for within this hour of time, you have allowed people to recollect, right? We've been able to recall, we've been able um, to see where we meet, right? Along the lines in that, if we do more sharing and more conversations, we can all be that pebble in the water, as I like to say, that's plopped in the water and the ripples go out. We are that pebble, and the people who we interact with are those ripples, and so that we can continue to spread. So thank you, Lisa, so much for sharing. Please give her all the hearts across the screen right now for sharing, for being vulnerable, for sharing the family picture that we should all try our best to share our roots. We had Loretha with Shankleville story last summer. We had Dr. Hinojosa with his story. We've had others with their stories. You can find these stories on our Project Unity website of other listen and learns. But being able to trace back to our origins and find out who we are and how that shaped us is so important. So
Yes,
thank you so much, Lisa.
and please go back and listen to those. I mean, Opal Lee's story, the Reverend Peter Johnson, he was so inspirational. When I was going through imposter syndrome, like, can I speak in this series? He said, all of us have contributed to the history of Dallas. We are all characters in this
Mhm.
story, and we all can help be a part of writing the story going forward. right? I was like, it wasn't how long you've been here, it's what have you done once since you got here.
Since you got here. That's right, absolutely. Well, thank you again, Lisa, for being here tonight. And I want to thank you all for joining our September Listen and Learn series. We hope to keep you engaged with another session next month. But until then, take care of yourself, take care of each other, and we hope to engage with you again soon. I'm Charlene. Thank you all again. Have a good night.